enhance internationalization and partnership, and also to underpin institutional and national higher education reforms. And it also has a political function, of course, in bringing Europe and its citizens closer together. This has been, with some variations, the narrative for more than 20, maybe 30 years. But as some of you may recall, back in 2009, both the EU and the Bologna Process decided to set out a mobility benchmark of 20% of graduates that should have a mobility experience by 2020. Now, with the delays that data collections usually entail, we are now in 2023 in the position to confirm that the benchmarks have been failed. Therefore, the Bologna Process already in 2020 has reconfirmed the 20% benchmark and has also set out a new one, namely that every student should get some international exposure, be it through mobility or by other ways. And we will talk about this later on in this webinar. The EU has just recently, in November, proposed a new enhanced benchmark of 25%, which may include, and this is now really a novum, also blended mobility. What is astonishing in all this, there is actually not much discussion on mobility, at least not currently at European levels, neither on the benchmark and also not more generally about mobility and forms of mobility and alternative approaches. Hence, this webinar tries to make a contribution here. And let me briefly introduce our panelists. I have here Howard Davies, who is Senior Advisor at EUA. Then we have Piet van Hove, Director of the International Relations Office at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. And he is also President of the European Association for International Education, EAIE. And I have with me Tanguy Guibert, Vice President of the European Students' Union, ESU. And normally I should have here Maija Innola, but we face some technical difficulties. We hope to get her back here in the course of the webinar. Normally my colleague Hove would be here to chair the webinar, but I'm replacing here today due to what I would call seasonal sickness. She is somewhere in the webinar and listens in. So we plan to discuss mobility here in the panel, but you are very much welcome to contribute with comments and with questions. And for this reason, we have already, or we will put up now, our first poll. And you can actually, it's, I think you know how to do that. So you can have respond to the questions here. And I give you a moment time of taking this up. I'm not sure, can we show this on separate screens? Can we start with the presentation already?
Do you want the presentation, Michael?
Can you keep this up? Can you keep this open in addition so that people could see it? And then we could start the presentation.
I will leave it open, but I can display only presentation or
Good.
The poll. Yeah.
We leave it open, we come later on back to the results, yeah, and we start the presentation. So I hand over to Howard for a presentation.
Thank you, Michael. I hope you can hear me. And thank you for your introduction. Thank you too for inviting the panel. I think that's very important because they are practitioners, policymakers and practitioners, and what they have to say is very important, and I look forward to hearing what they have to say. I have 6 slides here, based, I should say, on a publication which came out at the end of the summer, and so doesn't contain reference to some of the developments that Michael has mentioned. It contains, I should say, no explicit recommendations. The main point of it is to generate discussion and to try and accelerate the process of forming consensus on some of the issues that it raised. Aurélie, can we move to the first slide then, please? Thank you very much. There's no need for me, I think, to itemize the factors of disruption. Everybody's quite familiar with them. I should say that my impression is that they have affected quite seriously the modes of mobility, the direction of mobility flows, and the adequacy of the metrics which are applied to mobility. All of this in the last 3 years. Michael has already indicated that the 20% benchmark has never been reached. And if you refer to the last edition of the Bologna implementation report, you will see that the reporting methodology has improved somewhat, but still remains patchy. So it means, in effect, that any estimate of the mobility rates are precisely that. They are estimates rather than absolutely accurate figures. The last figure we have, which you should locate in the context of the 20% target, is an overall mobility rate of 9.4%. My last point on the slide, and I'm going to pick items from the slides, I should say that, because they're fairly dense, and I hope they will be useful to you for reference later on. Where is Laurie van Troek, is my last question. I'm not sure if that will mean anything to you, so let me reminisce very, very briefly. Somewhere at the end of the 1980s, possibly 1990s at the beginning, the Commission put out an introduction to ECTS, and it had an ideal mobile student. It was male, and it was Dutch, and it conducted 1 year of full-time education in the Netherlands. It then proceeded to Germany for another year, and it then proceeded to UK for a 3rd year, where it got a bachelor degree. And finally, it went on to the maîtrise in France, where it got a 4th year. So this was an ideal student who was mobile in a different country in each of the 2nd and 3rd and 4th years of a 4-year program. We called her Laurie van Troek because that was the most mobile name we could think of, and we assumed that she was female. I'm not quite sure why, but that's the explanation there. Did she ever exist? Were there ever students who were mobile to such an extent, proceeding from year 1 to year 2 to year 3 to year 4 in different countries and accumulating language competence and qualifications? Aurélie, next slide, please. Okay, we discuss in the paper international traineeships, and the points to retain from this slide, I think, are as on the left there. There is no international definition of a traineeship. That is according to the EUA, which is the Bible of the statisticians. We know, however, that traineeships are supported by Erasmus+, including for the year following graduation. They exist in many other regimes, many other legal regimes, notably in the single market and in free trade agreements. But because there's no definition, there's no overarching oversight by governments, and there is therefore no total that is available. It would be useful if a total of traineeships existed, because then it might be possible to incorporate it in the target, and it might raise the level of participation. Aurélie, please, next slide. We also discussed the question of branch campuses and franchises operated from abroad. Again, on the left in blue, you can see the remarks made by the Statistician's Manual in 2020 edition. Such operations do not involve international learning mobility, because only physical cross-border mobility can be counted towards the 20%. So it's worth asking, particularly if we want to go forward one slide, please. Okay, we're there. What happens when the university is mobile and it is not the student who is mobile? It's a question, as I say, which is worth asking, particularly if you want to expand the catchment of eligible students and therefore boost the total numbers of mobile students in order then to attempt to reach the target. The question really is this: is it time to revisit the prohibition put in place by the EUA there on branch campuses and franchises operated from abroad? Do they have a valid international experience, cultural, linguistic, academic, that could be reckoned then as a form of mobility? Is there an added value that can be expressed in ECTS and computed as a mobility? I ask the question because it has an implication for the metrics which are then used to calculate levels of mobility across the European higher education area. I'm moving to my next slide, please, Aurélie. Thank you very much. Michael mentioned already that in 2020, the ministers reaffirmed the 20% target, but they also said that they would be interested in achieving some form of mobility, I'm quoting, whether in physical, digitally enhanced, virtual, or blended formats. But they didn't say whether these other forms of mobility would count towards the target. I think everybody now agrees that virtual learning can enhance physical mobility. And of course, the converse is also true. Physical mobility can enhance virtual learning. And as you probably know, in the Erasmus Plus program now, there exist blended intensive programs which require physical mobility between 5 and 30 days, plus an unspecified volume of what Erasmus Plus and the Commission call virtual exchange. And the blend must carry at least three ECTS points, which is effectively 1 week of physical mobility. And that raises, in my mind, the question of credibility. Is it indeed credible that 1 week of mobility in an academic program constitutes a mobility that is legitimate to count in the attempt to reach the 20% target? Aurélie, next slide, please. I'm moving in order to try and complete within my 7 minutes. Move to the third bullet point, if you would, by all means, looking at the left-hand column, where the Commission, in its November publication that Michael mentioned, reiterates the definition contained in the Statistician's Bible. Learning mobility means moving physically to a country other than the country of residence. In the European University Alliances, 50% of seamless mobility is targeted, not being immediately clear what seamlessness means. And we now know from November that the European Commission has proposed a new target for higher education in the European Union of at least 25% by 2030. Definition is unchanged, but the element of blendability is introduced, and current Erasmus Plus practice has put that, has enshrined it in the current arrangements. The Commission also says in the publication that reaching this target of 25% will likely depend on an expansion of the alliances, of the number of alliances, plus an embedded mobility requirement in the future European degree, which it has spoken of in previous publications. It then says, because it does not have absolute exclusive competence in this area, that member states are invited to make voluntary commitments. I hope some of those remarks are clear. And on the next slide, which is the final slide, I go to some of the questions which linger in my mind. I think I have to say, I think my thinking is a little bit clearer since the Commission has published its latest proposal in November, but nevertheless, questions remain. The first one I've mentioned already: how can we reach, as an academic community, a European academic community, how can we reach consensus regarding metrics. Should really mobility of 1 week count as an integer, a whole number, or should we begin to consider it as a possible fraction of a total and then use that fraction to compute the total mobility rate? I also worry about the 1 week of mobility. It suggests to me that there is still a possibility that Erasmus, despite the efforts to prioritize inclusion, remains effectively a two-tier system, where those who can afford 1 year of mobility engage in it, and when those who cannot afford 1 year of mobility commit at the very minimum to 1 week of mobility. Should there be separate targets? This we discussed to some extent in the briefing. I haven't mentioned them hitherto today, but I think they're relevant because if we do institute separate targets for masters and doctorate, it implies also that there should be a separate target for the bachelor. And that, I think, is something that's worth discussing. But the final question really, in the light of the fact that the targets have not been achieved, or the Bologna target has not been achieved, that the 50% of the alliances is said not to be probably achievable, are targets useful? And I look forward to the comments of my colleagues in the panel and to colleagues out there in the ether. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you so much, Howard, for setting the stage here for on such a complex matter. I realized that I invited participants to submit questions, but I haven't really told them how to do that. So there is a chat function, which is for exchange among participants, but then there is also a Q&A function in which you could, where you could include your questions. I can't see any questions for the moment. So I'm turning then towards Tanguy and Piet. Any immediate reaction on Howard's presentation and the questions that he raised?
Yeah, I could go immediately to the very last question. Are targets useful, mobility targets? I would say probably not, but now maybe I'm spoiling what will follow in the rest of my considerations. But I noticed some gaps in the logic, actually. I noticed Howard asking the question several times, is this or that legitimate to count as a valid international experience, like the short mobility or the branch campus potential mobility? But I don't think we actually have criteria to assess whether something is a legitimate international experience or not. And for physical mobility, longer term physical mobility, we just assume it. When we send or bring a student across a national border, that suddenly the magic happens and there is useful international and intercultural interaction and competences being developed. We just assume it in the case of physical mobility. So also there, we don't really have clear criteria other than the credit transfer. We assume that when credits are transferred and recognized from a university in one country to a university in another country, that constitutes somehow useful mobility, and that leads to the outcomes that we intend to have from internationalization, which is, in my mind, a dangerous assumption. So to then expand the question and ask, is participating in a program in a branch campus of a foreign university that establishes in a different country, is that a legitimate internationalization experience? We don't know. We don't have criteria. Is my immediate reaction.
I think that's a very important point. So in the past, we relied on duration, I would say, and that students physically cross borders and achieved learning outcomes. And these were the indicators that this is a useful mobility. And we can't apply these criteria for new or alternative ways. Absolutely, yeah. Tanguy, any comment from your side?
Okay, yes, please, and thank you first of all for the presentation, and to continue on the question of the branch campuses. I mean, indeed, there is no aspect to know whether it's a full full experience mobility or not. But I mean, maybe it's more food for thought. But I mean, according to us, I mean, when we come to mobility, there is two aspects that should guide what should a mobility is. Like the first one is the personal experience, and then personal mobility experience to discover new culture and everything, like the whole thing that we all know, but also the academic perspective. And for example, if you go if, for example, because France is the country that exported its campuses and higher education institutions the most, and Sorbonne University is one of these universities that is that has a campus offshore. So, for example, if you're a student in France in Sorbonne University and you go in other Sorbonne University, I mean, you can expect that eventually the teaching methods and the way of thinking and to, you know, have the whole picture of your lessons might be the same, where all the advantage also to go on mobility is also to discover new ways of thinking, because I mean, from one country to another, some topics might be seen differently. So indeed there is no way, but I mean, we think that there is two valuable aspects in mobility. So that's the thing. And on the last question as well, are the targets useful? And that's a really interesting question. Actually, I would say that are they useful or not? I don't know, but at least they set an objective, a political objective to reach. Because if there is, let's say, let's start with the idea that imagine that there is no targets, it would mean that each higher education institution could do whatever they want. So if they don't want to spend time or finance or HR resources in mobility, it would mean that for some students in some higher education institution, there would no mobility at all, which would be a problem, because it could create two-tier system from one higher education institution to the others. So are they useful? I would say yes, but maybe not as they are decided and reflected upon right now, because I think that they should be done and reflected in a more pragmatic way and a more realistic way. And if we would need to increase them, maybe more gradually, and not just because we want to improve them, but maybe with a reflection behind. But I will explain maybe in later questions.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I mean, the Bologna Process implementation report of 2020 that takes stock of the 2 decades of work under Bologna makes the point that the targets were probably useful, assuming that if we wouldn't have had them, we would have had probably even less mobility. And I think that's also my feeling, as I have been around when the benchmark was actually put out. And this came after about a decade of reiteration of the fact that mobility is valuable and should be enhanced in ministerial communiques. And there has been, up to that point, no European level data collection on it. And at the time, the benchmark has been put out quite as a blind date. We didn't know how much mobility we actually had. And what is a bit probably puzzling then, that afterwards we didn't really, there was no real discussion in the Bologna process also on how to systematically enhance mobility and also to face some of the quality questions. But is that still, my question would be also, is that still a good way of taking it forward now? I mean, a composite benchmark like the one that has been reconfirmed by the Bologna ministers, or the one that has been put out by the European Commission of 20, respectively 25%, without a differentiation of credit and degree mobility, without differentiating on whether at what level it is. There was a question here in the chat on whether third cycle doctoral mobility counts into the mobility benchmark. Absolutely, it does. So it consists of mobility at bachelor, master's, and doctoral level. But what we saw is that at master's and doctor level, we reach more than 16%, whereas at bachelor's level, it's actually under 10% across Europe.
Michael, can I come in?
Yeah, please. Please.
With responses to Tanguy and to Piet, just very briefly, I agree that Piet, I agree that there are no qualitative criteria, and that the criteria that do exist are quantitative. That's to say, in terms of duration, by and large. The question then is, should there be criteria? Should there be qualitative criteria? But subsidiary to that is my feeling that learning outcomes, that assessment procedures might imply criteria that could be brought to bear on students who are apparently enjoying some experience that might be described as international. So that's one way forward, and I imagine that it does take place. But again, it would be randomized because there is no institutional requirement that learning objectives or learning outcomes and assessment procedures actually measure the international experience. Tanguy, I wondered about the targets and your remark on targets. It seems to me that at EHE level, of course, the target isn't binding. It cannot be binding. And the only way in which it could be made binding were if member states or signatory countries were to adopt the target and impose it on their participating institutions as a mandatory requirement. That is to say, country X could say, okay, we need 20% of participation, and we will therefore require it and fund it accordingly. To my knowledge, this hasn't happened. Should it happen? Is that one way of carrying the target forward?
If I may jump in there, I understand what you're saying, Howard, but it begs the question, is it true that what can be measured is by definition valuable, and whatever is valuable can be measured? I don't think so. So to me, I mean, a mobility benchmark can be useful, especially as a way of tracking trends. But I would see the only real benchmark that I'm interested in is 100%. I think what we should be aiming for is 100% of students having useful, meaningful international exposure, international interactions, international collaboration in whatever way is feasible and whatever way is useful in the context of that program and that student. So to say then of that 100%, 20% should involve physical mobility, I find that rather arbitrary. But because it will depend a lot on different circumstances, and also what I have as a more fundamental objection to that, to put that benchmark at the center, is what we have seen from some very useful research in recent years, is that in fact with physical mobility we are reaching the group of students that in a way needs it the least, that already has a high social capital associated with the outcomes of mobility. So already has the eagerness to learn, the curiosity, the willingness to engage with different people in different circumstances, and so on. So that's, if you look at it critically, and there is some very interesting research now showing that there is a huge aspect of selection bias in so that's my more fundamental objection to focusing too much on that benchmark. Not saying, I mean, that doesn't mean that mobility, physical mobility, is in fact a very impactful and very unique mode of internationalization. I agree with that, and definitely be valued and used in an even more purposeful way than it is now. And it should remain a key tool that we use in internationalization, but I would see it as just one of the possible tools, and to focus too much on the thing that suits so far 10 to 15% of students is, I think, not the best way to focus our attention and our resources.
Is there not, and this is a question from Nick Mitchell, is there not then a risk that we establish a kind of two-tier system, so that internationalization at home or these blended or virtual moods would actually be for students who can't afford it, and the other ones well, then they go really physically mobile.
If I may, just
and if I
briefly,
could just one more, and a second proposal is then, should not the Commission or universities just pay for the study experiences of poorer students, allowing them to go abroad for longer than a week?
Well, to that last point, that may sound like it's logical, but in reality, what we see is that the large group of students that I would estimate at least 50%, maybe 60 or 70%, is actually not interested at all in an international experience. And that's the group that you also won't reach necessarily with those kinds of measures. And that's exactly the group we should be focusing on. I think the first point about positioning internationalization at home as a second-tier option is exactly what you achieve by putting the mobility benchmark front and center. I mean, then implicitly what you achieve is, okay, certain students are successful in going on mobility, and for the rest of them, we have internationalization at home. And I think the way to counter that impression or that implicit message is to put internationalization for all first, and to say then, okay, in certain circumstances, some students can and will go on mobility, but the thing foremost that we want to achieve is to make sure that all students during their higher education are put in a situation of international exposure, international collaboration, being in conversations with peers in other countries, through whatever communication means, and in a way that is well designed so that it is actually impactful, and that it creates a situation where the student is out of their comfort zone, depends on developing a basis of trust with international colleagues to solve a problem together, to work on an assignment together, and using the communication tools that are available. So that's something that can, and in my mind, should be in a curriculum for every student. And then you can complement that with mobility options for those that can actually do that and that are interested in doing that, and so on. But I think the narrative is important, and I think putting the benchmark 20%, 25% benchmark front and center creates, in my mind, the wrong basis for an internationalization narrative.
Okay. That confirms actually the second benchmark that the Bologna ministers have introduced in 2020, that every student should have an international experience, also by other means than physical mobility. I have the feeling Maija can hear us and can probably also speak. Is that right?
Yes, I try to jump in.
Great, yeah, please.
All right. I'm so sorry about the technical problems, but I'm happy that you are able to hear me.
It worked perfectly well yesterday when we tried it out.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Just for the
all
record.
right. So first of all, I would like to say that the setting up the benchmarks are useful in that sense that it brought sort of political interest to internationalization and mobility. But of course, I can see also that it has perhaps overshadowed the other sort of objective that Michael just mentioned, that everyone should have possibility in their program to have a sort of mobility window or internationalization window built in, so that everyone has the sort of internationalization experience during their studies. And I feel that this is at least as important as setting up sort of physical or blended mobility benchmarks. And I can say that it's not reality, although we have talked about this also in Finland for a long time. But from the recent Eurostudent national survey results that we see, there is a difference between cycles, differences between the type of higher education institutions concerning mobility, and also differences in of fields of study. And one thing that struck me as an obstacle of mobility mentioned by students is that there is a lack of motivation or the perception of the utility of the mobility is not always high. So those are perhaps issues that we have to dig a little bit deeper also in the sort of program planning, and we have to raise the awareness of the utility of internationalization in general, and also mobility in its different forms.
Thanks, Maija. This is actually something that confirms something that Piet also observed, that there is a relatively large percentage of students who are not really interested in mobility. An interesting observation. So it's not only probably an economic issue. Tanguy, any comment on this?
Yeah, so that's interesting to hear that students might. I mean, of course, maybe not all of them want to do a mobility, but also because not all curricula are at the moment designed to do some mobility, and there is also because if from day one you hear that mobility is not made for you, or you never hear about mobility, I mean, of course, the idea that mobility is a possibility for you, of course, that's it's not in the range of the possibilities. I mean, for example, you take almost all the health studies in Europe right now, the mobility is almost not possible for them. Like there is less than, I can't remember if it's 2 or 5% of health students. And by health students, I mean, talking about medicine, pharmacists, dental students, nurses, and etc. That for them, mobility is not possibility for them. Then what are we talking about from the students that don't want to do mobility? Is this only the students that actually can do a mobility from the curricula that we know that mobility is a thing, or from all the others, like the whole student population as a whole? That's also a question that I have right now, because I mean, that's actually something. And then why do they don't want to do a mobility? That's also a question that I do have, because I completely understand and acknowledge the fact that not all students do want make a mobility during their curricula, because I mean, the interests of all the students are really different, and the students is not one population, homogeneous and everything, so not everyone wants to do the same thing to achieve their studies. So that make me think that your remark, Piet, on the 100% target mobility is interesting, because I mean, in the idea, it allows that. I mean, how I see it is like it's more about allowing all the students that want to do a mobility they can make a mobility. But as you already rightly said, not all the students want to make a mobility. So I mean, the question of the target is, but it's not really the target. But I would say that it's more about all the students that would like to make a mobility. They should allow, and they should have the means to do the mobility in the best conditions possible. And I think that the topic is here about accessibility and in the right way. And of course, how and when. And I completely also apply to your comment that maybe like the mobility, what mobility means, and what do we want as international experience? That's also a big questions, and maybe the questions about why the students don't want to make a mobility, because maybe all of them don't want for sure make the same types of mobility. That's what we can see with the alliances right now, because the students involved in the alliances proposal and experiences right now, they're doing a lot of BIPs, the main intensive programs, and they're all really thrilled about it, which is really different from a semester mobility, credit mobility. So, but they actually don't require the semester mobility that much, because the BIPs for them is the perfect types of international experience they wanted. So, I mean, it's also about the needs also depends a lot on where you are coming from and the sets where you are coming from. So I would say that, but again, it rejoins the fact that we do not have a lot of data about mobility and how mobility is conducted right now. So yeah. And
can I come in?
Please, yeah.
Michael, can I? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, very. Very quickly, I agree with. I have an echo now. I don't know why. I'm sorry. I agree with Piet that internationalization for all is an excellent policy. I also agree with the spirit of Nick Mitchell's question. And I think that internationalization at home carries the risk with it that we actually have a three-tier system. That's to say zero mobility, the 1 week mobility, and the 12-month maximum mobility. That is the risk. However, let me make another point, responding really to Tanguy's reference to healthcare professionals and the unwillingness, apparently, of students in those disciplines to be mobile. This is paradoxical. This is paradoxical. If those students are the most reluctant to be mobile, ultimately, when they are at work, they are the most mobile of professionals within the European Union. This is very, very strange, is it not? And it's one of the reasons why I think that cross-border traineeships should be maximized as much as possible. I have the feeling, and I could document it, but I don't want to here, that each of the EU initiatives on higher education is visibly subordinate to the priority of labour market integration. And this may be the reason why the EU target of 25% is higher than the EHEA target of 20%. What the EU wants is much more cross-border mobility of students and much more cross-border mobility of professionals, because that's where it perceives the strategic advantage to be. And I think that labour market requirements are often understated by professionals in the higher education sphere, and it should be made more explicit, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think what you said is absolutely evident also as the Europe on the Move was launched in the context of skills and talents, and big initiative of the Commission to point to the need to recognize third country qualifications. By the way, we got also a comment from Jan, who mentioned that the intra-EU mobility is actually much higher. It's 13%, he says. That's actually true, but the Bologna benchmark is, of course, drawn up on the 49 countries in the wider Europe, and there it is indeed under 8. But as we have said already, it definitely doesn't count all the mobilities that take place. The system still requires some improvement. From all what I hear here is that we have probably two different issues, isn't it? The one that we really have to ensure an international experience to all students. So this means reflection on curricula and also on how we could better use the technical means that are already explored with methodologies that are already explored in many universities so well. And then the other one on how we deal with mobility in the future. Is that what we are looking actually at? But we should probably not mix the two ones, and also as it might not be very clear what we are measuring then.
Exactly.
Sorry. So would it then make sense to probably we should look at can I have the results of the poll that we have done? So if we could look at, can you make that a bit larger? I can not probably read this. Yeah. So that's might give us a better understanding on how mobility is dealt with at institutions. So we can see here what actually counts and is counted at institutions. Do you have any comments on this? Who wants to come in? I mean, it's a relatively small number, of course, that we have here, but we can see nevertheless that the majority of universities have procedures in place for collecting student mobility. and a much smaller number also collects then data on virtual mobility or virtual exchanges.
May I just ask a question on that? From my own experience in my university, the only thing that's really easy to capture in the databases is credit transfer. Is when you see in a specific student's curriculum that there is a number of credits there that were obtained from another university. So that's the only thing that's easy to capture. And of course, that could be either through mobility or by recognizing an online course followed by a student at another university. And I would really, going back to what was said earlier and what I also try to say, question that as being the most relevant criteria. There are many examples of internationalization of the curriculum, of online collaboration that actually don't involve credit transfer, but that are very useful internationalization experiences. And on the contrary, there are also examples of following simply kind of passively following an online course in another university is not necessarily a very rich international experience, although there could be then, so, on the face of it, international credit transfer. So that again brings me to the point that it's not always what's most convenient or easy to measure that's the most impactful experience. So I would really question that.
I think the point, Howard?
No, I would add on the results of the poll there that the fact that the institutions have clear procedures for collecting data on student mobility doesn't mean that the data is consistent. Beyond Erasmus Plus, where data collection I think is standardized, beyond that, then data collection by institutions depends largely on the national funding regimes, and these are not identical. And therefore, data is collected necessarily in different ways and cannot easily be aggregated. So it is another problem of metrics, I think.
That's true, but I think the question is also: do we actually need an accurate record of how much mobility takes place, or do we need an accurate record of, or a better record of how much mobility takes place at institutions and countries and is recognized by them? I think that might also be a methodological question.
Well, if we have a target, then we need the metrics. Otherwise, the target makes no sense.
Yes, that's true. But I mean, it probably brings us back to the point that Piet had. We would have then also to define, for example, for the virtual exchanges, we would have to clearly define what we want actually to count and what we don't count. And the question might be, do we actually undermine then the actual goal that, and I'm quoting here Regina, who has made a comment, should not nowadays certain learning outcomes and competences rather be spotlighted that could be achieved through mobility actions. Otherwise, we just strive for mob benchmarks and have to play again and again what the added value of mobility actually is.
Yes.
Yeah. So it becomes a qualitative, where we just said we would separate the virtual or internationalization at home agenda from the physical mobility. Nevertheless, both have probably to cope with the question of what makes them actually international and what makes them so valuable with regards to learning and teaching and to the student experience.
Was there a second poll?
We have a second poll, and if we could just launch that. And while that is ongoing, maybe I could go one step back and just ask, do you have, we're already here. Again, can we have this a bit larger? the graph? I'm afraid I can't read it, sorry. And it seems nobody else can read it.
Well, the largest, the segment in blue is lack of established procedures. Yeah. Which is 33%.
Yeah, so we asked for the challenges in virtual and blended student mobility. And then...
Sorry, I was able to magnify it on my screen. So what I find interesting here, the purple ones, the small ones,
Yeah.
only 3% says it's lack of interest among students. That's the main challenge. So that to me is quite encouraging. Because
that it is so relatively small, you say?
Yes, that it's not a big barrier. So
yeah,
it implies that most students are open to that idea of engaging in virtual or blended international experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And, lack of digital skills and competences is also relatively small at 13%. That might be a post-pandemic situation where people have gotten used to, more used to online engagement. So that's also...
I think that one I can confirm. We gathered data under the Trend Survey this year, and what we can see that between 2019 and 2022, the number of institutions that use virtual exchanges, however that might be defined, increased by 40%. So from around 20% to 60%, and another 20% plan to use it more systematically in the future. So definitely on the side of the institutions, but of course also for staff and students, then this has become a much more common way of exchanging. I'm just asking myself, if I put that together with what you, Piet, and Maija said before, that relatively, and Tanguy questioned this to some extent, that a relatively large number of students actually does not want to become mobile. And also, if I look at the relatively low numbers that we have for at the bachelor level, is that, I mean, it may have some economic reasons. It could have to do with the problems that you face in these relatively short bachelor programs, which are just 3-4 years. I remember a decade ago still, we had lots of discussion, how can I fit Erasmus semester or 1-year mobility into a 3-year bachelor program? But it could also have to do with the fact that students may prefer actually to some extent other ways of getting an international experience, and something that would allow them to stay in at home in their surrounding, and does not necessarily require to travel abroad. Is that likely? I mentioned it also because we have these ongoing discussions on that we have a generation that actually is much more seems to be much more in favor on doing things online and virtually than we had this before. So do we face that a kind of change in the attitude towards virtual mobility, towards physical mobility?
Only to say, Michael, that if we wanted to further reduce the percentage of uninterested students, it would be useful to know what the system level regulatory barriers are. I'm slightly puzzled by the 17%. If there's somebody in the chat who could give an example of a system level regulatory barrier, that would be very useful. 17% of barriers at system level is quite substantial. And I guess the first approach that would be useful would be to try and reduce those.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure what they are.
Well, if somebody could give an example, that would be really great. I can only speculate that this is what we had seen pre-COVID, that in several systems, the use of online was not really permitted, or only if you do it to a small extent, and not and that in most systems changed then for the COVID period, that we have also seen pressure to move back to on-campus education afterwards, which would then likely also undermine international exchanges, of course, that you could facilitate virtually. But that's an speculation, and let's see if somebody comes in the chat there.
Yes, Michael, I think there was in the chat at least that all programs are not so, they don't have, or they don't recognize in the curricula the possibility for the mobility, virtual or not. So that might be one of the sort of obstacles that are built in. And of course, this is from my part as well only speculation, but it seems that there are several reasons of lack of interest, or also the sort of structural barriers depending on the field, and also depending on the student life situation. But for me, I think it is interesting to see if the sort of world of higher education and how we provide it will be changed by the effort of having more joint programs, effort to have European university alliances, where one of the ideas is that you can take part of your degree at least from the other institution, from the alliance. So that it is definitely something I think we should follow very closely. What happens and what kind of sort of possibilities there are for the students to get the virtual or physical mobility throughout these alliances and joint efforts of universities. And of course, it can create a sort of more open sort of catalog of courses that you can choose from, and it shapes the way we build the programs and curricula from what it is now. So it also is one of the opportunities that we have now.
So to have a closer look at what takes place under the alliances, but also probably in other networks at the moment, these emerging practices, share them and get a better understanding. We have actually here a comment now in the chat. Nick mentions that not all curricula and academic calendars are fit yet for the blended intensive programs. That's an indicator of what could be still a hindrances. But as we also carried out survey on Erasmus Plus, we got actually very positive feedback there on the blended intensive programs. So apart from the one downside that from the observation that they also create a lot of work for staff. So while virtual exchanges sound always very casual and they actually imply a lot of work. All right, good. I think time is up. So if you want to have a final comment on the discussion, what would you like to read in the Tirana communique on mobility? What should ministers commit to?
Well, if I may, I would confirm the value of mobility and would like to see more equitable access to mobility for all students who wish. And so more, I saw it also in the chat, more emphasis on academic recognition the fact that the mobility, the activities during mobility actually count and don't prolong the study time of the student. That's all very important, but I would like to see that framed in a vision of internationalization for all. Actually, that would be my wish. So to value mobility, but frame it in a larger vision of internationalization for all.
Maija, anything to add?
Yes, I think there should be sort of highlighting the mobility and internationalization again. I think it should be on the focus again in a strong way. I think one aspect is also that we should say in the Tirana community also that we should have more effort to close the sort of implementation gaps, because I think the Bologna has been very successful creating tools that also enable mobility, like quality assurance, recognition, use of ECTS, and so on. So that's also important, and that we do our best to close the implementation gap and make the sort of mobility and internationalization work also in practice as well as we can. And also I would like to see that the utility and the importance of mobility and internationalization is highlighted again. And sort of it might be a good idea, as Piet proposed, that we have a sort of new vision that is fitted to today's realities in some way, that we adding something to the having that creating possibilities for everyone, but also capturing what this kind of internationalization and mobility could be today.
Tanguy?
Yeah, thank you. No, imagining what we can add on the Tirana communique, I would say that I would say a truly and really strong commitment from the member state towards mobility and internationalization for the students, and also, I mean, in removing all the barriers to mobility, of course, because as we saw that it's one of the reasons that in the willingness of the students themselves to participate on mobility, I truly believe that that it's linked, because the students are really sensitive to all the barriers that exist. I mean, they might they know more than we can think, of course, and also, of course, really strong commitments to make mobility and internationalization really accessible for everyone. And of course, it's not free, and it requires maybe a lot of at least some investments at some point. So that also, I would say that it could be a really strong message also sent to the whole higher education community, that the member states commit to invest properly on mobility and internationalization.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Howard, last word from you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I feel very ambivalent. I do not like the subordination of higher education to labour market considerations, but on the other hand, unless our economies prosper, then the level of mobility is going to go down further. And so I would appreciate it if the ministers in Tirana spoke a little bit more about internships, work placements, traineeships, whatever they like to call them, and do their best to promote them on a cross-border basis. That would be my priority, I think.
Thank you very much. I think these were really very complementary suggestions that we can put together. Definitely food for thought, and hopefully we will get something of this into the Tirana communique and have an opportunity to follow up on this in the next round of the Bologna process. We're closing here, and that's also the closure of our webinar series for this year. We have the next event upcoming on the 16th of January, which will then be about unpacking recognition from the basics to automatic recognition across the EHEA. And this will be followed, as you can see, by student-centered learning and the European QA framework. So practically there's every month until Tirana and also a bit after Tirana, where we will meet and discuss Bologna topics. Thanks for Tanguy, Maija, Piet and Howard for joining us here today and for sharing your views. I wish you all a good Christmas holiday and see you again next year. Thanks. Bye.